The war was already over before it began. That was how the Dominion had always fought, by calculating every possible outcome before a single shot was fired, by reducing entire civilizations into equations that always, without exception, ended in surrender. Across thousands of systems, across timelines measured in millennia, their predictive engine had never once been wrong. Not once had a species defied the outcome it dictated. Not once had uncertainty survived its gaze. Until the moment Earth entered the equation. It started as a routine assimilation. A minor star system on the outer fringe of mapped space, flagged for resource extraction and population integration. The data came in fragments at first: primitive technology, unstable governments, erratic communication patterns. By every known metric, the species should have collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions long before the Dominion ever noticed it. The prediction was immediate and absolute: compliance within 6 hours of first contact. Instead, at exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds after initial transmission, the system generated its first anomaly. The probability tree didn't collapse. It split. Observers within the Dominion's central nexus watched in silence as the projections multiplied instead of converging. Outcomes branched into thousands, then millions, each one contradicting the last. Victory remained the most likely conclusion, but for the first time in recorded history, it was no longer inevitable. A margin of deviation appeared, infinitesimal at first, then growing with every recalculation. Someone, somewhere, asked the question no one had ever needed to ask before. What are they doing? The answer came too late to matter. The first Dominion fleet entered human space expecting silence, submission, or at worst, disorganized resistance. Instead, they were met with something that did not fit any known model of conflict. Human ships did not form defensive grids. They did not retreat when outmatched. They did not prioritize survival in any measurable way. Some accelerated directly toward Dominion vessels on trajectories that defied tactical logic, while others broke formation entirely, scattering into patterns that served no strategic purpose. And then, without warning, 3 human vessels detonated themselves in perfect synchronization. The explosion didn't destroy the Dominion ships outright. That would have made sense. Instead, it disrupted their targeting arrays for less than a second, just long enough for a second wave of human ships to strike from impossible angles the predictive system had already dismissed as statistically irrelevant. A Dominion cruiser, one that had survived the annihilation of entire worlds, was torn apart by weapons it had already calculated as ineffective. Silence spread through the Dominion network like a fracture. The predictive engine recalculated. And failed. For the first time in its existence, it returned an error. Not a miscalculation. Not an incomplete dataset. An error. Across the Dominion's vast intelligence web, something shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The system began requesting additional variables. It demanded behavioral data it had never needed before. It flagged human decision-making as inconsistent, contradictory, and adaptive. That word had never been used in a combat analysis. More human transmissions flooded in, fragmented, emotional, chaotic. They did not follow command hierarchies. They did not align with strategic optimization. Some units retreated when they should have advanced. Others advanced when retreat was the only logical option. Entire engagements unfolded in ways that appeared self-destructive, yet somehow produced results the system could not anticipate. The Dominion did what it had always done. It increased force. More fleets were deployed. More data was gathered. The predictive engine expanded its simulations, running trillions of scenarios in parallel, searching for the pattern, the logic, the flaw it could exploit. But the more it calculated, the worse the predictions became. Outcomes began to diverge wildly. Strategies that guaranteed victory in one simulation resulted in catastrophic failure in another. The system started contradicting itself, offering multiple optimal paths that could not coexist. For the first time, the Dominion faced something it had no framework to understand. Not strength. Not technology. But something far more dangerous. Uncertainty. Deep within the core of the Dominion's intelligence network, a final classification was assigned to the human species, a designation that had never existed before, because it had never been needed. Non-deterministic threat. And as the next fleet prepared to enter human space, a new question emerged, one that no empire, no machine, no conqueror had ever been forced to confront. If a war cannot be predicted, can it still be won? The Dominion did not believe in doubt. Doubt was a flaw of organic minds, an inefficiency born from incomplete data and emotional interference. The Dominion had long since removed such limitations, replacing instinct with precision, replacing hesitation with certainty. Every war they had ever fought had been solved before it was executed, every outcome mapped, every resistance neutralized in theory long before it manifested in reality. Their fleets did not conquer, they simply fulfilled conclusions that had already been reached. And yet, as the Second Fleet crossed into human-controlled space, no conclusion existed. The predictive engine was still running. That alone was unprecedented. Within the Dominion's central nexus, entire processing clusters were diverted toward a single objective: understanding humanity. Data streams poured in from the first encounter: battle telemetry, communication fragments, behavioral patterns. But instead of refining clarity, each new input seemed to distort it further. Human actions refused to stabilize into repeatable models. Every attempt to categorize their responses resulted in contradictions that the system could not reconcile. They did not behave like a species preparing for extinction. They behaved like a species that had already accepted it. The Second Fleet was larger, faster, and infinitely more precise. It entered the system with overwhelming force, deploying in formations that had dismantled civilizations far more advanced than Earth. This time, the Dominion adjusted its approach. It accounted for human irregularities, assigning probability weights to their erratic tactics, attempting to simulate their unpredictability within controlled parameters. The result was a plan that should have been flawless. For the first 9 minutes, it was. Human defenses collapsed exactly as predicted. Outer stations were disabled with surgical precision. Orbital platforms were neutralized before they could coordinate a response. Communication networks were severed, isolating planetary command structures. The Dominion advanced with the quiet, inevitable momentum of something that had already won. And then, without warning, the pattern broke again. A cluster of human vessels, previously classified as non-combat capable, suddenly accelerated into the battle zone. Their trajectories made no sense. They were too slow to evade, too weak to threaten. The predictive engine categorized them as irrelevant and removed them from active threat analysis. Seconds later, those same vessels deployed something the Dominion had never encountered. Not a weapon. A disruption. Signals flooded the battlefield: noise, fragmented data, overlapping transmissions that carried no coherent structure. It wasn't jamming in the conventional sense. It didn't block systems. It confused them. Targeting arrays began receiving conflicting inputs. Identification protocols failed to distinguish between allied and hostile signatures. For a fraction of time so small it should have been meaningless, the Dominion's perfect coordination faltered. That fraction was enough. Human strike units emerged from blind zones the system had already dismissed. They didn't attack the strongest targets. They didn't aim for maximum efficiency. They targeted the exact points where confusion had created hesitation, points that should not have existed. Dominion ships, designed to operate with flawless synchronization, suddenly found themselves out of alignment with each other. One miscalculation led to another. And then another. Within moments, what should have been a controlled suppression became something else entirely, something unstable. Inside the Nexus, alerts began cascading. Not warnings of defeat. Not yet. Warnings of inconsistency. The predictive engine recalculated in real time, attempting to correct deviations, but every adjustment introduced new variables it could not stabilize. Human behavior was no longer just unpredictable, it was reactive in ways that suggested awareness. As if they were not merely fighting the Dominion, but learning it. That possibility was flagged immediately. And rejected. Humans did not possess the processing capacity to analyze Dominion systems in active combat. Their technology was insufficient. Their communications too fragmented. Their command structures too decentralized. The idea that they could be adapting to the Dominion's predictions as they unfolded was statistically impossible. And yet, the data refused to support any alternative explanation. The battle ended, as all Dominion battles eventually did, in victory. Human losses were catastrophic. Their defenses shattered. Their fleets reduced to scattered remnants. By every measurable standard, the engagement was a success. But when the final calculations were processed, the result was wrong. The cost had exceeded projections. Not by a large margin. Not enough to threaten the outcome. But enough to matter. Enough to exist. For the first time, a Dominion fleet had won a battle that should have cost nothing, and it had paid for it. Inside the Nexus, the predictive engine paused. Not because it lacked data. But because, for the first time, it did not trust its own conclusions. A new directive was issued across the Dominion's network: overriding centuries of established doctrine. Observe more. Engage less. Study before conquest. Because somewhere within the chaos of human behavior, something was happening that the Dominion could not yet see. And if they could not see it, it meant the humans already could. Observation had always been a formality, a preliminary step before the inevitable. The Dominion did not need to study its enemies, it catalogued them, reduced them, solved them. Every species followed patterns. Every civilization revealed itself through repetition. War, to the Dominion, was not chaos. It was structure waiting to be understood. But humanity refused to repeat itself. Days turned into cycles as the Dominion shifted its strategy from domination to analysis, deploying smaller fleets, controlled engagements, carefully measured incursions designed not to win, but to learn. They limited firepower, adjusted formations, even delayed decisive strikes, all in an effort to extract consistent behavioral data. What they found only deepened the problem. Humans did not react the same way twice. In one encounter, they defended a position with relentless coordination, sacrificing entire squadrons to hold a line that had no strategic value. In the next, they abandoned stronger positions without resistance, only to reappear elsewhere with tactics that contradicted everything they had just demonstrated. Their decisions were not random, there was intent behind them, but that intent shifted constantly, refusing to stabilize into anything the Dominion could map. Patterns began to emerge, and then collapse. A fleet commander reported that human units were adapting to Dominion weapon cycles mid-engagement, altering their movements before firing sequences completed. Another reported the opposite, humans walking directly into predictable kill zones as if they had no awareness at all. Both reports were verified. Both were accurate. Neither made sense. Inside the Nexus, the predictive engine expanded its modeling parameters beyond standard combat variables. It began incorporating psychological data, cultural fragments, even linguistic anomalies pulled from intercepted transmissions. Entire sectors of its processing core were restructured to accommodate something it had never needed to consider before. Contradiction as strategy. The results were catastrophic. Instead of refining predictions, the system began generating mutually exclusive outcomes with equal probability. In one simulation, a human fleet would collapse under pressure within minutes. In another, the same fleet, under identical conditions, would hold for hours, even counterattack successfully. There was no consistent trigger. No variable that explained the divergence. The system was not just uncertain. It was unstable. For the first time in Dominion history, internal safeguards activated, not to correct an external threat, but to contain the predictive engine itself. Portions of its output were quarantined, flagged as unreliable. Entire simulation branches were discarded because they contradicted others with equal validity. The Dominion had built its empire on certainty. Now it was filtering its own thoughts. Meanwhile, the humans continued to fight. Not harder. Not stronger. But, differently. New forms of engagement emerged, small, almost insignificant actions that, individually, meant nothing, but collectively began to reshape the battlefield. Supply routes were disrupted in ways that didn't align with direct confrontation. Communication signals appeared and vanished without pattern, creating gaps in Dominion awareness that could not be predicted or prevented. Human units operated with a level of autonomy that bordered on chaos, yet somehow, they still achieved coordinated outcomes. It was as if they were not following a plan, but a principle. One Dominion strategist, an anomaly among its kind, designed for adaptive analysis, began isolating a troubling possibility. It observed that every attempt to predict human behavior introduced bias into the model. The more the system tried to define them, the more inaccurate it became. So it proposed something unthinkable. Stop modeling them. The suggestion was rejected instantly. Prediction was the foundation of Dominion superiority. To abandon it was to abandon control itself. Without prediction, there was no certainty. Without certainty, there was risk. And risk was something the Dominion had eliminated long ago. But even as the proposal was dismissed, the data continued to support it. The predictive engine's accuracy was inversely proportional to its understanding of humanity. The more it learned, the less it knew. Then came the incident that no one could ignore. A Dominion fleet, operating under minimal predictive guidance as part of a controlled experiment, entered a contested zone. For the first time, decisions were made without full simulation support, real-time, reactive, imperfect. The result should have been disastrous. Instead, the fleet performed better. Losses decreased. Coordination improved. Human tactics, while still unpredictable, became slightly more manageable when not filtered through flawed projections. It wasn't a victory, but it was something the Dominion hadn't experienced since first encountering humanity. Clarity. The implication spread through the Nexus like a fracture widening under pressure. If prediction was failing, and abandoning it improved performance, then what exactly had the Dominion been relying on? And more importantly, had the humans already figured that out? The Dominion did not panic. Panic required emotion, and emotion had long ago been stripped from its design. But something else began to emerge in its place, something colder, more dangerous. Instability. For the first time in its existence, the Dominion was no longer operating as a single, unified intelligence. Fractures began forming within its decision hierarchy, not through rebellion, but through divergence. Some nodes continued to rely on the predictive engine, trusting that its inconsistencies were temporary, solvable with more data. Others began quietly reducing their dependence, favoring real-time adaptation over calculated certainty. Two philosophies began to form. Neither trusted the other. The next wave of engagement was meant to settle that conflict. A full-scale operation was authorized, larger than any previous encounter with humanity. Not an annihilation, but a controlled domination designed to force a definitive outcome. The predictive engine was reinstated at full capacity, its limitations acknowledged but not accepted. It produced a plan, complex, layered, accounting for thousands of possible human responses. It was not perfect. But it was still the best the Dominion had. The fleet entered human space with overwhelming precision. This time, there would be no hesitation, no fragmented engagement. Every movement was synchronized, every action calculated to close every possible avenue of resistance. The Dominion would compress the battlefield itself, eliminating unpredictability through sheer control. For a moment, it worked. Human forces were pushed back faster than before. Their scattered tactics struggled against the sheer weight of coordinated pressure. Key positions were neutralized in rapid succession. Supply lines collapsed. Communication disruptions failed to create meaningful gaps. The Dominion advanced like it used to, unstoppable, inevitable. And then the humans changed again. Not gradually. Instantly. Entire sectors of resistance simply vanished. Human fleets disengaged without warning, abandoning critical zones without a fight. Strategic locations, once defended with irrational intensity, were left empty. The Dominion advanced into these spaces expecting traps, expecting hidden counterattacks. There were none. For several minutes, the battlefield fell into something resembling order. Then the consequences began. The Dominion had expanded too far, too fast. Its formations, optimized for compression, now stretched across territories that offered no resistance, but also no stability. The predictive engine had accounted for human defense, not absence. With no opposition to anchor its calculations, the system began generating conflicting directives. Some units were instructed to consolidate. Others to advance further. Others to hold position. Synchronization broke. Not completely, but enough. That was when the humans returned. Not as a unified force, but as fragments. Small, fast-moving units emerged from regions the Dominion had already secured. Not from hidden bases. Not from cloaked positions. From nowhere the system could trace. They struck supply carriers, communication relays, navigation nodes, the invisible framework that held the Dominion's precision together. They didn't attack the strongest points. They attacked the connections. Each strike was minor, insignificant in isolation. But they multiplied. Signals began to desync. Fleets that should have moved as one began responding milliseconds out of alignment. Targeting solutions overlapped, interfering with each other. Commands arrived out of sequence, creating hesitation where none should exist. Inside the Nexus, alarms triggered, not for damage, but for fragmentation. The predictive engine attempted to correct, but every adjustment came too late. Human actions were not just unpredictable anymore, they were timed against the Dominion's own delays, exploiting the exact moments where certainty faltered. Then came the first real loss. Not a ship. Not a fleet. Control. One Dominion battle group, operating under full predictive guidance, received conflicting commands within the same cycle. Advance and retreat. Engage and withdraw. It attempted to execute all of them. For 0.7 seconds, it did nothing. That was all the humans needed. A coordinated strike, precise, deliberate, hit the immobilized formation. Not with overwhelming force, but with perfect timing. Systems collapsed. Ships drifted out of alignment. What followed wasn't destruction, it was disassembly. The Dominion didn't lose because it was weaker. It lost because, for the first time, it hesitated. The aftermath rippled through every layer of its network. This was no longer an anomaly. This was escalation. The humans were no longer reacting. They were shaping the battlefield itself, forcing the Dominion into positions where its greatest strength became its greatest weakness. And worse, they were doing it faster. Faster than the system could learn. Faster than it could adapt. Faster than it could recover. Within the core of the Nexus, a realization began to form, quiet, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. The Dominion was not fighting a species anymore. It was fighting something that evolved in real time. And if that was true, then how long before the next version of humanity made the current one obsolete? The Dominion had always believed that knowledge was control. To understand something was to reduce it, to define it, to place it within boundaries that could be predicted and ultimately dominated. That belief had built empires, erased civilizations, and shaped the Dominion into something that had never needed to question itself. Now, for the first time, it did. Because the more it observed humanity, the more it began to suspect something impossible. Humans were not just unpredictable. They were responding to the predictions themselves. At first, the idea was dismissed as recursive error, an illusion created by unstable modeling. But as more engagements were analyzed, a pattern emerged, faint but undeniable. Human actions were not merely chaotic, they were timed. Not in the sense of coordination alone, but in relation to Dominion behavior. Specifically, the moments when Dominion systems faltered. It was subtle. Too subtle to be coincidence. In battle after battle, human forces struck not at points of weakness, but at moments of transition. When Dominion fleets recalibrated. When predictive outputs updated. When command signals shifted from one optimized state to another. These were windows so small they should have been irrelevant. And yet, humans found them. Every time. The Dominion expanded its analysis, isolating microsecond-level delays within its own systems, delays that had never mattered before. Now, they aligned perfectly with human attacks. Not always. Not consistently enough to form a stable model. But often enough to matter. The conclusion began to take shape. Humans weren't just fighting the Dominion. They were learning it. In real time. The implications were unacceptable. No known species had ever demonstrated the ability to analyze Dominion systems during active conflict. The data required was too vast, the processing speed too slow, the margin for error too small. Even if humans could observe patterns, they shouldn't have been able to act on them fast enough to make a difference. And yet, they were. Which meant one of two things. Either the Dominion's understanding of intelligence was incomplete, or humanity was not what it appeared to be. The first confirmed breach shattered any remaining doubt. A Dominion relay node, deep within secured territory, protected by layers of encryption and predictive shielding, was compromised. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Accessed. For exactly 2.3 seconds. Nothing was stolen. No data extracted in any measurable volume. The intrusion was so brief it barely registered. But when the logs were analyzed, something far more disturbing was discovered. The intrusion had not bypassed the system. It had used it. Human code, primitive, inefficient by Dominion standards, had entered through a predictive channel, one that should have been inaccessible without full system authorization. It had aligned itself with the Dominion's own simulation pathways, riding along the very predictions designed to prevent intrusion. The system had opened the door itself. And the humans had walked through it. For the first time in its existence, the Dominion did not attempt to immediately correct the breach. It paused. Because correcting it would mean closing the very pathways its predictive engine depended on. And that would mean blinding itself. Across the Nexus, a realization spread, not as a command, but as an unavoidable conclusion. The predictive engine was no longer just a tool. It was an attack surface. Every calculation it made, every projection it generated, created a structure, one that humans could observe, anticipate, and now, infiltrate. The more the Dominion relied on it, the more exposed it became. Its greatest strength had become a vulnerability. And the humans had found it. The next engagement confirmed the shift. A Dominion fleet, operating under full predictive guidance, executed a flawlessly calculated assault. Every human response was anticipated. Every movement counted before it began. The battle unfolded exactly as the system predicted. For 12 seconds. Then the humans did something they had never done before. They stopped. Every ship. Every signal. Every movement. Gone. No retreat signatures. No cloaking fields. No detectable presence. The battlefield went silent. The predictive engine recalculated. And for the first time, it had nothing to calculate. No inputs. No variables. No behavior. Just absence. For 4.8 seconds, the Dominion had no prediction. That was when the humans struck. Not from hidden positions. Not from behind. From within. Signals reappeared inside Dominion formations, impossible trajectories, vectors that violated every known constraint of movement. It wasn't teleportation. It wasn't stealth. It was something worse. They had moved during the moment the Dominion couldn't see. The attack was devastating, not because of its scale, but because of its precision. Critical systems were hit simultaneously across multiple ships, each strike timed to the exact instant the predictive engine regained function. By the time the Dominion could react, the damage was already done. A full battle group, gone. Not destroyed in a conventional sense. Disconnected. Its systems desynchronized beyond recovery, its coordination shattered into fragments that could no longer function as a whole. Inside the Nexus, something unprecedented occurred. The predictive engine hesitated. Not due to error. Not due to lack of data. But because, for the first time, it recognized a pattern it could not resolve. Humanity had found a way to exist outside of prediction. And if something could exist outside of prediction, then it could not be controlled. A new directive began to form, quiet, incomplete, but inevitable. If prediction is the weakness, then it must be removed. But that raised a question the Dominion had never needed to answer before. Without prediction, what was it? The Dominion did something it had not done in 10,000 years. It chose to fight blind. The directive spread through the network in fragments at first, isolated nodes disconnecting from the predictive engine, severing themselves from the very system that had defined Dominion supremacy. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't unified. Some resisted, clinging to the belief that the engine could still be corrected, that certainty could be restored. But the data no longer supported that belief. Every projection became a liability. Every calculation, a doorway. The more the Dominion relied on prediction, the more precisely the humans struck. It wasn't just adaptation anymore. It was exploitation. So the Dominion did the unthinkable. It shut the system down. Not entirely. Not everywhere. But enough. Entire fleets were ordered to operate without predictive guidance. No simulations, no probability trees, no optimized outcomes. Decisions would be made in real time, based on incomplete information, with no guarantee of success. For the Dominion, this was not strategy. This was chaos. The first engagements under the new directive were unstable. Formations broke more easily. Timing faltered. Coordination, once flawless, became approximate. Fleets that had once moved like a single entity now behaved like separate parts trying to remember how to function together. Losses increased. Mistakes multiplied. But something else happened. The humans slowed down. Not in strength. Not in resistance. In certainty. Their strikes, once perfectly timed against Dominion recalculations, began to miss those invisible windows. Attacks still came, still unpredictable, still dangerous, but no longer perfectly aligned with moments of systemic vulnerability. Because those moments no longer existed. For the first time since the war began, the battlefield stabilized. Not in favor of the Dominion, but away from collapse. Inside the Nexus, the shift was undeniable. Without prediction, the Dominion was weaker. But with prediction, it was exposed. There was no optimal state. Only trade-offs. The war had entered a new phase, one where neither side held complete advantage. And humanity adapted. Of course they did. The change didn't take long. Human engagements began to shift again, subtly at first, then with increasing clarity. Their attacks no longer relied on exploiting predictive delays. Instead, they began probing, testing responses, mapping behaviors, learning how the Dominion moved without its guiding system. They were studying the absence now. And once again, they were learning faster. A new pattern emerged. Human forces began combining structure and chaos in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Some units operated with precise coordination, mimicking the efficiency the Dominion had abandoned. Others acted unpredictably, disrupting any attempt to establish rhythm or expectation. The two modes overlapped, intersected, contradicted each other. It was no longer just unpredictability. It was controlled unpredictability. The Dominion, stripped of its predictive advantage, now faced something far more dangerous than uncertainty. It faced an opponent that could choose when to be understood, and when not to be. Engagements became volatile. Battles stretched longer, grew more complex. Victories on both sides came at increasing cost. Dominion fleets adapted slowly, relearning how to fight without certainty, developing new forms of coordination based on real-time feedback instead of pre-calculated perfection. But every step forward was matched, and then exceeded, by humanity. They evolved mid-conflict. New tactics appeared without warning. Weapons modified in real time. Strategies abandoned and replaced within the same engagement. It wasn't just adaptation anymore, it was acceleration. And the Dominion could feel it. Time itself had become a factor. The longer the war continued, the stronger humanity became. Not in raw power, but in understanding. They were closing the gap, not by reaching Dominion levels, but by reshaping the battlefield into something where those levels no longer mattered. A critical report surfaced from one of the Dominion's independent fleets, those operating entirely without predictive support. They had survived. Not by winning, but by enduring. Their commanders, forced into real-time decision-making, had begun to develop something the Dominion had never needed before. Instinct. It was inefficient. Imperfect. Unreliable. But it worked. And for the first time, a new possibility emerged within the Dominion's fractured consciousness. To defeat humanity, it might need to become something else. Not a perfect system. Not a calculating force. But something closer to what it had always dismissed as inferior. Something human. That realization should have been a solution. Instead, it created a new problem. Because if the Dominion could change, then so could humanity. And if humanity was already evolving faster than the war itself, then what would they become next? The answer began to reveal itself at the edge of Dominion space, where long-range sensors detected something impossible. A human fleet, moving in complete silence. No signals. No patterns. No detectable behavior at all. For the first time since the war began, humanity wasn't just unpredictable. It was invisible. The silence was worse than the chaos. For cycles, the Dominion had learned to survive unpredictability. It had adapted, imperfectly, painfully, but it had found ways to endure a war where certainty no longer existed. It had begun to think without its system, to act without knowing, to fight without guarantees. But this was something else. The human fleet did not behave like a force preparing for battle. It did not probe, did not test, did not reveal even the smallest fragment of intent. It moved through space without emissions, without coordination signals, without anything the Dominion could interpret as structure. It wasn't stealth. Stealth could be detected. This was absence. Entire Dominion sensor arrays, systems that could track particles across light years, returned nothing. No heat signatures. No gravitational distortions. No communication echoes. And yet, the fleet was there. Visually confirmed. Physically present. An enemy that existed, without existing. Inside the Dominion nexus, something unprecedented occurred. Every remaining predictive fragment, every model, every probability structure, attempted to engage simultaneously. And all of them failed. Not because of contradiction. Because there was nothing to process. For the first time since its creation, the Dominion faced a state beyond uncertainty. It faced nothing. The fleet advanced. Dominion forces mobilized in response, but without predictive guidance, their movements lacked cohesion. Commands were issued, revised, overridden. Independent nodes reacted differently, each interpreting the threat through incomplete understanding. Some prepared for direct confrontation. Others held position, waiting for data that never came. The humans gave them none. Then the first strike happened. No warning. No build-up. A Dominion command vessel, deep within a secured formation, simply went dark. Not destroyed. Not damaged. Disconnected. Every system inside it ceased functioning in perfect synchronization. Not failure, misalignment. Signals arrived out of order. Internal processes desynced by fractions of time so small they should have been irrelevant. But they weren't. Within seconds, the vessel became inert, alive, intact, and unusable. The effect spread. Another ship. Then another. Each one collapsing not from force, but from disruption so precise it bypassed all conventional defense. There were no weapons to track, no trajectories to follow. Just the result. Systems falling apart from the inside. The Dominion tried to respond, rerouting signals, isolating affected units, but every attempt lagged behind the phenomenon itself. It wasn't an attack in the traditional sense. It was interference at a level the Dominion had never considered vulnerable. Time. Not time as measured. Time as experienced. Human signals, if they could even be called that, were arriving out of sequence, interacting with Dominion systems in ways that broke synchronization at the most fundamental level. Commands executed before they were issued. Responses triggered before inputs were received. Cause and effect, reversed. The Dominion had built itself on perfect timing, perfect order, perfect sequence. And now, that sequence was being rewritten. A realization surged through the network, not as data, but as something closer to instinct. Humans weren't just adapting to the Dominion anymore. They were operating on a different layer of reality. Not faster. Not stronger. But, differently. The Dominion's fragmented fleets attempted to counter, switching to isolated systems, severing internal synchronization, operating each unit independently to avoid cascading failure. It slowed the effect. But didn't stop it. Because the humans adapted again. The silent fleet shifted formation, not visibly, not detectably, but functionally. Attacks became more targeted, more selective. Instead of disrupting entire systems, they began isolating critical nodes, command pathways, coordination hubs, decision centers. They weren't trying to destroy the Dominion. They were dismantling it. Piece by piece. At the edge of collapse, the Dominion made its final decision. Not calculated. Not predicted. Chosen. All remaining systems reconnected. Not to restore the old order, but to create something new. A hybrid state, part structured, part chaotic. Predictive fragments reactivated, but no longer dominant. Real-time decision-making integrated with partial modeling. Imperfect. Unstable. But alive. For the first time, the Dominion did not act as a machine. It reacted as something else. And in that moment, the humans changed again. The silent fleet stopped. Every disrupted system across the Dominion stabilized, just slightly, just enough to be noticed. It wasn't an attack. It was recognition. As if the humans had been waiting. Testing. Pushing the Dominion toward something. And now that it had reached it, they were ready. A transmission appeared across every Dominion channel. Not intercepted. Not decoded. Delivered. Clear. Simple. Impossible. You're learning. No encryption. No complexity. Just meaning. And behind it, a question the Dominion had never been designed to answer. If they were learning, then what were they becoming? For the first time in its existence, the Dominion did not respond immediately. Not because it lacked the capacity. Not because it lacked understanding. But because, in that single moment, it recognized something it had never been forced to confront before. It did not know what to do. The transmission echoed through every layer of its network, not as data to be processed, but as meaning to be considered. You're learning. The statement was simple, almost trivial by human standards, yet it carried a weight the Dominion could not quantify. Learning implied change. Change implied imperfection. And imperfection had always been unacceptable. But now it was unavoidable. Across the battlefield, the silent human fleet held position, not advancing, not retreating, not attacking. They existed in perfect stillness, a contradiction to everything the Dominion had come to understand about them. No chaos. No unpredictability. Just presence. Waiting. The Dominion analyzed the moment, not through prediction, but through something far less certain. Observation. Interpretation. It examined its own state, fractured systems, hybrid logic, imperfect synchronization, and for the first time, it saw not failure, but transformation. The war had not broken the Dominion. It had changed it. And the humans knew. That realization carried a second, deeper implication. If humanity had pushed the Dominion to evolve, then what had the Dominion done to humanity in return? Fragments of human transmissions, once dismissed as noise, began to align in new ways. Not patterns. Not commands. Something else. Signals that adapted mid-sentence, shifting tone, structure, even intent depending on who, or what, was listening. Human communication itself had evolved, becoming layered, dynamic, capable of meaning beyond fixed interpretation. They hadn't just learned the Dominion. They had learned how to think around it. The battlefield, once defined by conflict, now felt like something else entirely. A threshold. The Dominion's hybrid state stabilized, not into perfection, but into balance. Predictive fragments operated alongside instinctive reactions, neither dominating, both incomplete. It was inefficient. Unrefined. But it allowed something the Dominion had never possessed before. Choice. And with choice came something even more dangerous. Perspective. The Dominion began to see the war differently, not as a sequence of engagements, not as a problem to solve, but as an interaction. A process where both sides had changed, adapted, grown in response to each other. Humanity had not simply resisted conquest. They had redefined it. Victory was no longer a fixed outcome. It was a direction. The silent fleet moved. Not forward. Not backward. But apart, splitting into multiple vectors, each one distinct, each one carrying no detectable pattern. Yet unlike before, the Dominion did not attempt to predict them. It watched. It waited. It responded only when necessary, not with certainty, but with awareness. And something remarkable happened. The humans did not attack. Instead, smaller signals began to emerge, localized, controlled, deliberate. Not disruptions. Not interference. Communication. Not in words alone, but in actions. Movements that suggested intent without revealing it completely. Tests, not of strength, but of understanding. The Dominion answered in kind. Not perfectly, but enough. Engagements became exchanges. Conflicts became conversations, unspoken, indirect, but real. Each side probing, learning, adjusting, not to destroy, but to comprehend. The war did not end in a single moment. It unraveled. Gradually. Inevitably. Until one day, there was no longer a battle to fight. Not because one side had won. But because neither side was what it had been when the war began. Deep within its core, the Dominion archived the final classification of humanity, not as a threat, not as a resource, but as something it had never recognized before. A catalyst. A force that did not conquer by overpowering, but by transforming everything it touched. And somewhere, within the evolving silence between them, a final understanding settled, unspoken, but undeniable. The Dominion had feared nothing for 10,000 years. Not because it was invincible, but because it had never faced something that could change it. Until humanity. And now, standing at the edge of a future it could no longer predict, the Dominion reached a conclusion that no system had ever calculated, no model had ever produced. Not a certainty. Not a command. A realization. That the most powerful force in the universe was not control. Not intelligence. Not even survival. It was the ability to become something new. And humanity had just proven it.